In the marble halls of a Beverly Hills mansion worth $47 million, silence had become the most expensive sound money couldn't buy. David Chen pushed through the mahogany doors of his study at precisely 2:47 p.m., expecting to find the usual sterile perfection that his housekeeping staff maintained with military precision. Instead, he discovered something that stopped his heart mid-beat. His 7-year-old son Marcus sat cross-legged in the center of the Persian rug, surrounded by dozens of torn photographs scattered like confetti around his small frame. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The boy's dark hair fell in gentle waves across his forehead as he methodically ripped another image in half, his movements deliberate and eerily quiet. The photographs were all the same subject, his mother, Elena, whose radiant smile now lay dismembered across the imported silk threads beneath him. The new housekeeper, a woman named Rosa Martinez, knelt 3 feet away from Marcus, her weathered hands folded in her lap. She wasn't trying to stop him. She wasn't speaking. She was simply present, watching the destruction with the patience of someone who understood that sometimes breaking things was the only way to begin healing them. David's briefcase slipped from his grip, hitting the floor with a sound that echoed through the cavernous room like a gunshot. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't look up. He simply continued his methodical destruction, as if his father's presence meant nothing more than another shadow passing through his world. Rosa turned her head slowly toward David, her brown eyes holding a calmness that unnerved him. She was perhaps 55, with silver streaking through her black hair that she wore pulled back in a simple bun. Her uniform was crisp but comfortable, not the starched formality he expected from his staff. There was something about her stillness that made David feel like he was intruding on something sacred. The room held its breath. David opened his mouth to speak, to demand explanations, to restore order to the chaos that had invaded his perfectly controlled world. But before any words could form, Marcus lifted his head for the first time in months and looked directly at his father. His small lips parted, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke his first words since the accident. "She's gone, Daddy. All the pictures can't bring her back." The clarity in those words hit David like a physical blow. For 5 years since Elena's death in that terrible car accident, Marcus had retreated into complete silence. No words, no eye contact, no physical affection. The boy had become a ghost haunting his own life, moving through their mansion like a shadow that money and therapy and the best specialists couldn't reach. But now, surrounded by the remnants of his mother's smile, Marcus had spoken. And his words carried the weight of a grief that David had spent 5 years trying to bury under work and wealth and the comfortable numbness of routine. Rosa didn't move from her position on the floor, but her voice carried across the room with gentle authority. "Mr. Chen, he's been saving these photographs under his mattress for 2 years. Today he decided it was time to let them go." David stared at the woman, confusion and anger warring in his chest. "You let him destroy Elena's pictures?" "I let him choose what to do with his pain," Rosa replied, her accent soft but her words firm. "Sometimes we have to break the old to make space for the new." David had hired Rosa Martinez through the most exclusive domestic agency in Los Angeles just 3 weeks ago. His previous housekeeper had quit without notice, claiming that the energy in the house made it impossible for her to work. David had dismissed her concerns as superstition, but now, looking at Rosa's serene presence in the midst of his son's breakdown, he wondered if there was more to the woman's resignation than he'd understood. Rosa's references had been impeccable. She'd worked for several high-profile families, always staying for exactly 2 years before moving on. Her previous employer, a tech mogul in Silicon Valley, had written a recommendation that bordered on poetry, describing Rosa as someone who sees what others miss and heals what others can't reach. David had assumed it was just flowery language from a grateful employer. Now he wasn't so sure. The silence stretched between them as Marcus continued his methodical destruction. Each tear of paper sounded like a small rebellion against the grief that had held him captive for so long. David found himself counting the pieces, as if quantifying the damage could help him understand what was happening in his own home. How long has he been doing this? David asked, his voice catching slightly on the words. 3 hours, Rosa replied. He brought down the shoebox himself. Sat right there and started with the oldest pictures first. The ones from when she was pregnant with him. David's knees went weak. He hadn't known Marcus even remembered those photographs existed. After Elena's death, David had packed away most of her pictures, unable to bear seeing her face in every room. He'd left a few formal portraits in the main hallway, the kind that looked more like museum pieces than memories. He'd never thought to check what Marcus might have salvaged from his mother's belongings. The boy held up another photograph, this one showing Elena laughing as she pushed a 2-year-old Marcus on a swing set in their backyard. For a moment, Marcus stared at the image, his small fingers tracing the outline of his mother's face. Then, with the same deliberate motion, he tore it in half. But this time, something different happened. A single tear rolled down Marcus's cheek, so small and perfect that David almost missed it. The boy didn't make a sound, didn't sob or wail. Just one tear, falling like a period at the end of a sentence that had been 5 years in the making. Rosa saw it too. Without moving from her spot, she spoke to Marcus in a voice so gentle it was almost a whisper. "It's okay to cry, Mijo. Your mama would want you to cry for her." Those words hit the room like a prayer. Marcus looked up at Rosa, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. His lower lip trembled, and another tear followed the first. Then another. And then, like a dam finally giving way after years of pressure, Marcus began to cry. Not the silent tears David had occasionally glimpsed when he thought the boy was sleeping. These were real sobs, raw and painful and absolutely necessary. Marcus doubled over, clutching one of the torn photographs to his chest, and let 5 years of suppressed grief pour out of him onto the Persian rug that had probably cost more than most people's cars. David stood frozen in the doorway, watching his son fall apart and come together simultaneously. Every instinct screamed at him to fix this, to make it stop, to restore the quiet order that had defined their lives since Elena's death. But Rosa's presence kept him rooted in place, as if her calm was a gravitational force that held the chaos in perfect balance. "Should I call Dr. Peterson?" David asked, referring to the child psychologist who had been working with Marcus for 3 years with minimal progress. Rosa shook her head slowly. "This isn't a medical emergency, Mr. Chen. This is a miracle." David stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. In his world, crying children meant problems to be solved, disorders to be treated, situations to be managed with the right professionals and enough money. The idea that his son's breakdown could be anything positive seemed impossible to grasp. But as he watched Marcus sob over the torn photographs, something shifted in David's chest. For the first time in 5 years, his son was expressing real emotion. For the first time since Elena's funeral, Marcus was acknowledging that she existed, that she mattered, that losing her had broken something fundamental inside him. Rosa reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a small packet of tissues, setting them on the floor within Marcus's reach but not forcing them on him. The gesture was so simple, so perfectly calibrated to offer comfort without intrusion, that David found himself studying this woman who had somehow accomplished in 3 hours what teams of specialists couldn't achieve in years. "How did you know?" David asked quietly. "Know what, Mr. Chen?" "That this would help him." Rosa was quiet for a long moment, watching Marcus's sobs gradually subside into hiccuping breaths. "I lost my own son when he was 8 years old. Leukemia. For 2 years after, I couldn't even say his name out loud. I thought if I didn't talk about him, if I didn't look at his pictures, the pain would go away." She paused, her eyes never leaving Marcus's small form. "But pain that gets buried doesn't disappear. It just grows roots. Sometimes the only way to heal is to let yourself break first." David felt something crack open inside his chest, a fissure in the wall he'd built around his own grief. He'd spent 5 years being strong for Marcus, being the provider and protector and rock-solid foundation. He'd never allowed himself the luxury of falling apart, never given himself permission to acknowledge that Elena's death had shattered him too. Marcus lifted his head, his face streaked with tears but his eyes clearer than David had seen them in years. The boy looked directly at his father and said, "I miss Mama." 3 words. Simple, devastating, beautiful words that cut through 5 years of silence and pretense and careful emotional management. David felt his own eyes burn with tears he'd been holding back since the day of Elena's funeral. "I miss her too, son," David whispered, his voice breaking on the admission. Marcus stood up slowly, his small hands still clutching pieces of torn photographs. He took a tentative step toward his father, then another. David remained perfectly still, afraid that any sudden movement might break whatever fragile connection was forming between them. When Marcus was close enough to touch, he stopped and looked up at David with those enormous dark eyes that were so much like Elena's. "Can you sit down, Daddy? You're really tall." David sank to his knees on the expensive rug, bringing himself to his son's eye level. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus studied his father's face with the intensity of someone seeing a person for the first time. Then, with movements as deliberate as when he'd torn the photographs, Marcus stepped forward and wrapped his small arms around David's neck. The hug was tentative at first, uncertain, as if Marcus had forgotten how such gestures worked. But as David's arms came up to encircle his son's small frame, something relaxed in both of them. Marcus pressed his face against David's shoulder and whispered, "I haven't hugged anyone since Mama died." David closed his eyes and held his son, feeling the solid warmth of the small body against his chest, breathing in the scent of Marcus's hair that still carried hints of the expensive children's shampoo Elena used to buy. It was the first physical affection they'd shared since those terrible days right after the accident, when Marcus had been too young to understand why his mother wasn't coming home and David had been too broken to explain. Rosa remained on the floor, giving them space but ready to intervene if needed. She'd pulled out a small notebook and was writing something in careful cursive, documenting the moment with the precision of someone who understood its significance. "What are you writing?" David asked, his voice muffled against Marcus's hair. "Notes," Rosa replied simply. "First voluntary physical contact in 5 years. Duration, 43 seconds and counting. Initiated by the child, sustained without distress." David pulled back slightly to look at her. "You're documenting this?" "Everything," Rosa said, meeting his gaze steadily. "Every breakthrough, every setback, every moment of progress. Healing isn't linear, Mr. Chen. It helps to track the patterns." Marcus remained in his father's arms, but he was listening to their conversation with the sharp attention that David remembered from before the accident. Elena used to joke that their son had been born eavesdropping, always absorbing conversations that adults thought were over his head. "Are you a doctor?" Marcus asked Rosa, his voice still slightly hoarse from crying. "No, me Joe. I'm just someone who knows about sadness. And about getting better." Marcus considered this with the gravity of a much older person. "Did you get better?" Rosa smiled for the first time since David had entered the room, and the expression transformed her entire face. "I'm still working on it. But yes, I got better. Different than before, but better." Marcus nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to him. He disentangled himself from David's arms but remained close, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside his father. The torn photographs lay scattered around them like the remnants of a storm that had finally passed. "What do we do with all the pieces?" Marcus asked, looking at the destruction he'd created. Rosa closed her notebook and moved closer to them, her knees making soft sounds against the rug. "What do you want to do with them?" Marcus picked up a fragment that showed just Elena's hand reaching toward the camera, her wedding ring catching the light. "I don't want to throw them away. But I can't put them back together." "Maybe they don't need to be put back together," Rosa said gently. "Maybe they can become something new." David watched this exchange with growing amazement. In just a few hours, Rosa had somehow reached his son in ways that years of expensive therapy hadn't even approached. She wasn't trying to fix Marcus or cure him or make him normal. She was simply meeting him where he was and helping him find his own way forward. Like what? Marcus asked, his curiosity evident for the first time in years. Rosa reached into her apron and pulled out a small mason jar, the kind used for preserving fruit. In Mexico, where I grew up, we have a tradition called memory keeping. When someone we love dies, we don't try to preserve them exactly as they were. Instead, we transform our memories into something that can live alongside us in a new way. She held up the jar to catch the afternoon light streaming through the study windows. We could put the pieces in here, with some special things that remind you of your mama. Not to hide them away, but to keep them close in a different way. Marcus's eyes lit up with interest. What kind of special things? Whatever feels right to you. Some people use flowers, or stones, or small tokens that held meaning. The important thing is that you choose what goes in. David found himself leaning forward, drawn into this ritual that he'd never heard of but somehow understood immediately. That sounds beautiful. Rosa turned to him with an expression that was both gentle and assessing. Healing often is, Mr. Chen. But it's also hard work. And it can't be rushed or bought or managed like a business project. The words stung because they were true. David had approached Marcus's trauma the same way he approached everything else, by throwing resources at the problem and expecting results on a timeline. The best doctors, the most expensive treatments, the finest specialists money could buy. But none of them had been able to reach through Marcus's silence the way Rosa had in a single afternoon. Marcus was already gathering some of the torn photograph pieces, sorting through them with newfound purpose. Can we start the jar today? If your father agrees, Rosa said, looking at David meaningfully. David realized that this was a crossroads moment, a choice between returning to the safe numbness they'd lived in for 5 years or stepping into something unknown and potentially painful but undeniably real. He looked at his son, who was watching him with hope in his eyes for the first time since Elena's death. Yes, David said. We can start today. Rosa nodded and stood gracefully, smoothing down her uniform. I'll need to gather some supplies. Nothing expensive or complicated. Just simple things that can hold meaning. As she moved toward the door, Marcus called out, Rosa? She turned back to him, eyebrows raised expectantly. Thank you for letting me cry. The simplicity of his gratitude hit David like a physical blow. How had he created a world where his son felt the need to thank someone for permission to express his own emotions? How had he become so focused on managing Marcus's pain that he'd forgotten to honor it? Rosa smiled at Marcus with such warmth that David felt something shift permanently in the atmosphere of their home. You never needed permission, Mijo. You just needed to remember that it was safe. After Rosa left to gather her supplies, David and Marcus remained on the floor surrounded by the torn photographs. The silence between them was different now, less loaded with unspoken grief and more comfortable with shared understanding. Daddy? Marcus said quietly. Yes, son. Are you sad too? The question was so direct, so innocent in its complexity, that David almost laughed. Instead, he found himself being more honest than he'd been in years. Yes, Marcus. I'm very sad. I miss Mama every single day. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Dr. Peterson always asked me about my feelings, but he never told me about his. David realized that all of Marcus's therapists had maintained professional distance, treating the boy's grief as a problem to be solved rather than an experience to be shared. Rosa, in contrast, had offered her own story of loss, creating connection instead of clinical separation. How does it feel to talk about missing Mama? David asked, trying to follow Rosa's example of honest engagement. Marcus considered this seriously. Like my chest isn't so tight anymore. Like I can breathe better. They sat together in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by the beautiful destruction that had somehow cleared a path forward. David realized that this was the longest conversation he'd had with his son in 5 years, and it had taken a housekeeper's wisdom about grief to make it possible. When Rosa returned carrying a small wicker basket, she found father and son sorting through photograph fragments together, Marcus explaining to David which pieces showed his favorite memories while David listened with the intensity of someone making up for years of inattention. Rosa sat down with them and began unpacking her basket. Inside were simple treasures, smooth river stones, dried flowers that smelled like lavender, small pieces of colored glass that caught the light, strips of soft fabric in various textures, and several tiny wooden shapes that looked hand-carved. "These are just possibilities," Rosa explained. "Memory keeping is about choosing what speaks to your heart, not following rules." Marcus immediately reached for one of the glass pieces, a small blue fragment that gleamed like Elena's favorite sapphire earrings. "This one feels like Mama's laugh," he said with the matter-of-fact certainty of childhood. David watched his son handle the glass with careful reverence, and suddenly understood that this wasn't just about processing grief. This was about teaching Marcus that difficult emotions could be transformed into something beautiful, that loss could coexist with love, that breaking apart sometimes made space for new kinds of wholeness. Rosa began layering photograph pieces in the mason jar with ceremonial attention to placement and meaning. She worked slowly, allowing Marcus to hand her each fragment and tell her why he'd chosen it. David found himself drawn into the ritual despite his initial skepticism about such unscientific approaches to healing. As the afternoon faded into evening, their unlikely trio created something that transcended the sum of its parts. The memory jar became a vessel for conversations they'd never been able to have, tears they'd never been able to shed, and a connection between father and son that had been dormant for far too long. When they finally sealed the jar with a simple white ribbon, Marcus held it up to the last rays of sunlight streaming through the windows. The fragments inside caught and scattered the light like tiny prisms, transforming Elena's smile into something that felt both eternal and peacefully at rest. "Can we put it in my room?" Marcus asked. David started to suggest a safer location, somewhere the jar couldn't be accidentally broken, but Rosa caught his eye and shook her head almost imperceptibly. This wasn't about preserving a fragile object. This was about trusting Marcus with something precious. "Of course," David said. "It's yours." As they prepared to leave the study, Marcus took one last look at the Persian rug where his breakdown and breakthrough had occurred. "It looks different now," he observed. David followed his son's gaze and realized that Marcus was right. The room felt lighter somehow, as if the weight of unspoken grief had been lifted from its walls. The scattered tissues and empty shoebox seemed like evidence of a battle won rather than damage to be repaired. "Different how?" David asked. Marcus thought for a moment, then smiled with an expression that reminded David so powerfully of Elena that his breath caught. "Like it's not holding its breath anymore." Rosa gathered the remaining supplies and tucked her notebook back into her apron pocket. As they prepared to leave the study, she turned to David with an expression that was both professional and deeply personal. "Mr. Chen, what happened today was just the beginning. Marcus has 5 years of silence to work through, and healing isn't a straight line. There will be setbacks and difficult days ahead." David nodded, feeling both grateful and apprehensive. "What do we do next?" "We follow his lead," Rosa said simply. "We create space for whatever needs to emerge, and we don't try to control the timeline." As they walked through the marble hallways toward Marcus's bedroom, David realized that his house felt different too. The silence that had once seemed oppressive now felt spacious, full of possibility rather than emptiness. The perfect order he'd maintained as a bulwark against chaos seemed less important than the messy, beautiful work of healing that Rosa had introduced to their lives. Marcus skipped ahead of them, cradling his memory jar with the protective care of someone carrying something irreplaceable. For the first time in 5 years, David's son was moving through their home with lightness instead of merely existing within it. That night, after Rosa had helped Marcus place the jar on his nightstand and had gone to her quarters, David found himself standing in the doorway of his son's room. Marcus was already in bed, but he wasn't staring at the ceiling in the blank way that had worried David for so long. Instead, he was watching the moonlight play across the glass fragments in his memory jar, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Daddy?" Marcus called softly. "Yes, son. Do you think Mama knows we made something beautiful out of the broken pieces?" David stepped into the room and sat on the edge of Marcus's bed, a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary. "I think she'd be very proud of you for being so brave today." Marcus considered this, then asked, "Were you scared when I started crying?" The question surprised David with its perceptiveness. "Yes, I was. I wanted to make it stop because I thought crying meant you were hurting." "I was hurting," Marcus said matter-of-factly. But Rosa was right. It felt better to let it out than to keep it trapped inside. As David tucked his son in and kissed his forehead for the first time in years, he realized that Rosa Martinez had given them something more valuable than healing. She'd given them permission to be human, to feel their losses fully, and to trust that love could survive even the most devastating grief. The first day of their new life together was ending, but David sensed that the real journey was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new emotions to navigate, new opportunities for connection or setback. But tonight, for the first time in 5 years, both father and son would sleep knowing they were no longer alone in their sorrow. The silence in the mansion was different now. Instead of the heavy quiet of suppressed grief, it was the gentle hush of healing beginning to take root. And in a simple mason jar filled with torn photographs and colored glass, Elena's memory had found a new way to live alongside the people who loved her most. The sound of splintering would echo through the mansion at 3:17 a.m., followed by a crash that seemed to shake the foundation itself. David bolted upright in his king-sized bed, his heart hammering against his ribs as he tried to orient himself in the darkness. For a moment, his sleep-addled brain wondered if they were experiencing an earthquake, but then he heard something that made his blood run cold: Marcus screaming. Not crying. Screaming. Raw, primal sounds that David had never heard his son make, even in his darkest moments after Elena's death. David threw off his covers and ran barefoot down the marble hallway, his pajama pants catching on his legs as he stumbled toward the sound of destruction. Marcus's bedroom door hung off its hinges, the expensive mahogany splintered as if someone had taken an axe to it. Inside, his 7-year-old son stood in the center of what looked like a war zone. The memory jar lay shattered on the hardwood floor, its contents scattered like the remnants of a broken promise. Colored glass fragments glittered in the moonlight streaming through the windows, mixed with torn photograph pieces that had been ground underfoot. Marcus held his desk chair above his head, his small frame trembling with an effort that seemed impossible for someone his size. His pajamas were torn at the shoulder, and there was blood on his knuckles where he'd apparently punched something hard enough to split the skin. His eyes were wild, unfocused, as if he were trapped in some terrible dream that his body couldn't escape. Rosa appeared beside David so quietly that he startled. She was fully dressed despite the early hour, as if she'd been expecting this explosion. Her dark hair was pulled back in its usual bun, and she carried a small leather bag that David had never seen before. "Don't go in there," Rosa said quietly, placing a firm hand on David's arm as he started forward. "Not yet." "He's hurt," David protested, his voice cracking with panic. "Look at his hands." "He's fighting," Rosa corrected. "If you go in now, you'll become part of what he's battling against." David watched his son hurl the chair against the far wall, where it left a dent in the imported wallpaper before clattering to the floor. Marcus immediately grabbed for his nightstand, tipping it over with a crash that sent his reading lamp exploding against the baseboard. "This is insane," David breathed. "He's going to hurt himself." Rosa opened her leather bag and withdrew what looked like a small wooden flute. "He's not trying to hurt himself, Mr. Chen. He's trying to hurt the pain." Before David could ask what that meant, Rosa began to play. The sound that emerged from the wooden instrument was haunting and beautiful, a melody that seemed to come from some ancient place where sorrow was transformed into song. It wasn't loud enough to compete with Marcus's destruction, but it was persistent, weaving through the chaos like a thread of gold through dark fabric. Marcus froze mid-swing, his small fists still clenched around a picture frame he'd been about to launch across the room. His head turned toward the doorway where Rosa stood playing, his wild eyes struggling to focus on something beyond his own rage. Rosa continued playing, the melody rising and falling like breathing, like heartbeat, like the rhythm of waves against a shore. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Marcus's grip on the picture frame began to loosen. His shoulders, which had been bunched with tension, started to drop. The terrible stillness that preceded violence began to soften into something more like exhaustion. What is that song? David whispered. A lullaby my grandmother sang to me when the world felt too big and too sharp, Rosa replied between phrases. It doesn't have words. Sometimes words aren't what a broken heart needs to hear. The music filled the space between destruction and healing, creating a bridge that Marcus could cross when he was ready. David watched his son's breathing gradually slow from the sharp pants of panic to something deeper and more sustainable. The picture frame slipped from Marcus's fingers and landed on the carpet with a soft thud. Marcus sank to his knees among the wreckage of his own making, his small body finally overwhelmed by whatever storm had driven him from sleep into this frenzy of destruction. He didn't cry this time. He just knelt there, staring at the scattered pieces of his memory jar as if he couldn't quite understand how they'd gotten there. Rosa stopped playing and set the flute carefully on the hallway table. She stepped over the broken door and into the room, her movements deliberate and unhurried. David started to follow, but she held up one finger without turning around, a gesture that somehow conveyed both patience and absolute authority. Marcus, Rosa said softly, crouching down about 6 feet away from him. Can you tell me what you were fighting? Marcus lifted his head to look at her, and David saw that his son's eyes were clearer now, more present, though still shadowed with something that looked like terror. The dream came back, Marcus whispered. The one where I can't find her. I was looking and looking, and then I realized the jar was keeping her trapped in there, and I had to break it so she could get out, but now she's really gone and it's all broken and I can't put it back together. The words tumbled out in a rush, the most Marcus had spoken since that afternoon 3 weeks ago when they'd first made the memory jar together. David's heart clenched at the anguish in his son's voice, the way a 7-year-old's logic had twisted the healing ritual into something that felt like imprisonment. Rosa nodded gravely, as if Marcus's explanation made perfect sense to her. So you were trying to rescue her? Yes, Marcus said, relief flooding his voice that someone understood. But I think I made it worse. I think I lost her forever. Rosa reached into her pocket and pulled out a small cloth pouch that she opened with careful ceremony. Inside were more glass fragments, river stones, and pieces of fabric, similar to what they'd used for the original memory jar but somehow different, more varied in color and texture. In Mexico, we have another tradition, Rosa said, beginning to sort through the contents of the pouch. When someone breaks something precious by accident, we don't try to put it back exactly the same way. We make something new that honors both what was lost and what was learned from the breaking. She held up a piece of deep blue glass that caught the moonlight like a sapphire. Your mama isn't trapped in objects, Mijo. She lives in here. Rosa placed her hand over her heart. And here. She gestured toward David. And most especially here. She pointed to Marcus. Marcus looked down at his bleeding knuckles, then at the destruction surrounding him. But I broke everything. You broke some glass and some wood and some paper, Rosa said matter-of-factly. Things that can be replaced. But you didn't break your love for your mama, or her love for you. That lives in a place nothing can touch. David watched this exchange from the doorway, marveling once again at Rosa's ability to meet his son exactly where he was emotionally. Any other adult would have focused on the property damage, the dangerous behavior, the need for consequences and professional intervention. Rosa seemed to understand that Marcus's destruction had been an act of desperate love, not defiance. Can we make something new? Marcus asked quietly. If your father agrees, Rosa said, glancing toward David. But this time, we make it together. All 3 of us. And we make it stronger so it can hold bigger feelings without breaking. David stepped carefully into the room, avoiding the scattered glass. What did you have in mind? Rosa stood and gestured toward the corner where Marcus's bookshelf stood intact, the only piece of furniture that had escaped his rampage. We build a memory altar. Not something small that can be knocked over in a moment of pain, but something stable that becomes part of the room. Part of the house. Part of your lives. Marcus struggled to his feet, looking small and fragile among the wreckage. What's an altar? A special place where we keep the things that matter most, Rosa explained. Not to worship them, but to honor them. To remember that they're part of who we are. David found himself nodding, drawn to the idea of creating something permanent, something that couldn't be destroyed in a moment of overwhelming emotion. We could clear off the top shelf of the bookcase, he suggested. Make it into a dedicated space. Marcus walked over to the bookshelf and ran his fingers along the wooden surface. Would Mama like that? I think she'd love knowing that you were finding new ways to keep her close, David said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Rosa began gathering the fragments of the broken memory jar, handling each piece with the same reverence she'd shown during their first ritual. We'll use what can be saved from the old jar, and we'll add new elements that represent what you've learned from the breaking. As the three of them worked together to collect the scattered pieces, David noticed that Marcus kept glancing at the splintered door hanging off its hinges. I'm sorry I broke the door, Daddy. David looked at the damaged wood and felt an unexpected wave of pride rather than frustration. You know what? I think we should leave it like that. Both Rosa and Marcus stared at him in surprise. I mean, we'll make it safe, David continued, working through the idea as he spoke. But maybe we don't fix it completely. Maybe we let it remind us that sometimes we have to break through barriers to find what we really need. Rosa smiled at him with an expression that felt like approval mixed with something deeper, something that looked like recognition. In my country, we call that making peace with the scars. They spent the next hour carefully sorting through the debris, saving what could be saved and letting go of what was beyond repair. Marcus found 3 photograph fragments that were still intact enough to be meaningful, including a piece that showed Elena's wedding ring catching sunlight, just her hand against a background of sky. As they worked, Marcus began to talk about the nightmare that had triggered his destructive episode. In his dream, he'd been searching through endless rooms of their house, calling for his mother but getting no response. In the dream logic that only children and grieving people understand, he'd become convinced that she was trapped inside the memory jar and couldn't hear him calling. Dreams can feel more real than real life sometimes, Rosa said as she cleaned Marcus's scraped knuckles with antiseptic from her leather bag. Especially when we're carrying big emotions that don't have anywhere else to go. David watched Rosa bandage his son's wounds with the practiced care of someone who'd tended to more than just physical injuries. Have you done this before? Helped families through something like this? Rosa met his gaze steadily. Every family is different, Mr. Chen. But grief follows patterns. Breaking follows patterns. Healing follows patterns too, if we're patient enough to recognize them. By dawn, they had transformed the top shelf of Marcus's bookshelf into something that felt both sacred and lived in. The photograph fragments were arranged in a small wooden frame that Rosa had produced from her seemingly endless bag of supplies. The colored glass pieces were arranged in a shallow ceramic dish that caught and scattered light throughout the room. A small candle in a hurricane glass provided gentle illumination, and 3 smooth river stones represented the 3 of them, their family unit that had been forever changed but not destroyed by Elena's death. Marcus stood back to admire their work, his earlier frenzy replaced by something that looked like peace. It looks like a place where memories can live without being trapped. Rosa nodded approvingly. That's exactly what it is, Mijo. David found himself studying the altar they'd created, surprised by how right it felt in the space. Unlike the memory jar, which had been beautiful but fragile, this felt permanent, integrated into the fabric of their home in a way that wouldn't be easily disrupted by future emotional storms. Rosa, Marcus said quietly, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you have dreams about your son who died? The question hung in the air between them, more intimate than anything Marcus had shared before. David held his breath, wondering if Rosa would deflect or maintain professional boundaries. Instead, Rosa sat down on Marcus's bed, patting the space beside her in invitation. Marcus climbed up and settled against her side with the trustful ease that David had thought was lost forever. I do have dreams about Miguel, Rosa said softly. Sometimes they're beautiful dreams where we're playing together like we used to. Sometimes they're sad dreams where I'm trying to tell him something important but he can't hear me. And sometimes they're frightening dreams where I've forgotten what he looked like or how his voice sounded. Marcus nodded solemnly. Those are the worst ones. When you can't remember. Yes, Rosa agreed. But I've learned that forgetting some details doesn't mean forgetting the love. The love is bigger than memories. It's bigger than dreams. It's even bigger than death. David found himself blinking back tears at the simple profundity of Rosa's words. He joined them on the bed, creating a small circle of connection that felt both fragile and incredibly strong. Is that why you came to help us? Marcus asked. Because you understand about losing someone? Rosa was quiet for a long moment, her hand stroking Marcus's hair with maternal gentleness. I came because I believe that no one should have to carry their grief alone. And because I've learned that sometimes the best way to honor the people we've lost is to help heal the hearts they've left behind. The sun was fully up now, streaming through Marcus's windows and illuminating the destruction they'd cleared away and the beauty they'd built from its remnants. David realized that he should probably be exhausted after the sleepless night, but instead he felt more alert and alive than he had in years. I think we should have breakfast together, David said, surprising himself with the suggestion. In the kitchen. All three of us. Marcus perked up immediately. Can Rosa teach us how to make something? David looked at Rosa, who was already rising from the bed with a smile that suggested she'd been waiting for exactly this invitation. I know how to make the best chocolate chip pancakes in Beverly Hills, Rosa said. But they're messy to make. Flour everywhere, eggs to crack, chocolate to melt. Are you prepared for some chaos in that pristine kitchen of yours, Mr. Chen? David thought about his gleaming marble countertops, his professional-grade appliances that rarely got used for anything more complex than reheating takeout. Then he looked at his son, whose eyes were bright with anticipation for the first time since Elena's death, and realized that pristine had become another word for lifeless. I think it's time for some chaos, David said. The kitchen that had once been Elena's domain but had become a sterile showcase after her death was transformed over the next 2 hours into something that looked like a bakery had exploded. Rosa proved to be a teacher who believed in learning through doing, which meant that Marcus was soon covered in flour from his dark hair to his bare toes, cracking eggs with more enthusiasm than skill and stirring batter with the concentrated intensity of a scientist working on a breakthrough formula. David found himself drawn into the process despite his usual need for control and cleanliness. When Rosa handed him a whisk and pointed him toward a bowl of cream that needed whipping, he discovered muscles in his arms that he'd forgotten existed from years of delegating physical tasks to others. Daddy, you're getting it everywhere, Marcus giggled as David struggled with the technique of folding chocolate chips into batter without overmixing. I'm starting to think your mother was a genius for making this look easy, David replied, wiping flour from his cheek with the back of his hand. The mention of Elena didn't bring the usual uncomfortable silence. Instead, Marcus looked thoughtful. Mama used to let me help her cook sometimes, but she always cleaned up behind me so I didn't know I was being messy. Rosa paused in her demonstration of proper pancake flipping. What was her favorite thing to make? Cookies, Marcus said without hesitation. Sugar cookies with colored frosting. She said they were happy cookies because they could be any color you wanted them to be. David felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with unexpected memories of Elena, but this time it was accompanied by something else, gratitude for the reminder of how she'd filled their home with sweetness in both literal and metaphorical ways. Maybe we can make happy cookies sometime, Rosa suggested casually. If you think your mama would like that. Marcus nodded enthusiastically, then looked at David with an expression that was both hopeful and slightly worried. Would that be okay, Daddy? To make Mama's cookies? David realized that this was one of those pivotal moments that would be remembered years later, one of those seemingly small decisions that actually reshaped the entire trajectory of a relationship. He could play it safe, suggest they stick with Rosa's recipes to avoid potentially painful associations with Elena's memory. Or he could trust that his son was strong enough to handle the complex emotions that would come with recreating something beautiful from their past. I think that would be wonderful, David said. I think Mama would love knowing that her happy cookie recipe was still bringing joy to our kitchen. The smile that broke across Marcus's face was radiant enough to light up the entire mansion. For the first time since Elena's death, David saw pure happiness in his son's expression, unmarked by the shadow of loss that had colored every emotion for so long. As they sat down to eat the somewhat lumpy but undeniably delicious pancakes they'd created together, David realized that Rosa had accomplished something remarkable. She hadn't just helped them process their grief or taught them new coping mechanisms. She'd shown them how to build new traditions that honored their past while making space for growth and healing. "Rosa," David said as they cleared their plates, "I want to ask you something." She looked up from loading the dishwasher, her eyebrows raised expectantly. "How long do you usually stay with a family?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She was quiet for a moment, her hands stilling in their work. "That depends on the family. On what they need. On how long the healing takes." "But you've never stayed anywhere permanently?" Rosa dried her hands on a kitchen towel, taking time to fold it precisely before answering. "I've never found a place that felt like home since Miguel died. I've been helping other families find their way back to wholeness, but I haven't found my own." Marcus looked up from the syrup he'd been playing with on his plate. "Do you think you could find it here? With us?" The innocence of the question belied its complexity. David realized that his son was asking Rosa to consider something that went far beyond a professional arrangement. He was asking her to become part of their family, to root herself in their healing journey in a way that would transform all of their lives. Rosa looked at Marcus with an expression that held years of loneliness and hope in equal measure. "Would you like me to stay, Mijo?" "Yes," Marcus said without hesitation. "And I think Daddy would like it too." Both Rosa and Marcus turned to look at David, waiting for his response. He realized that he was being offered something he hadn't even known he'd been missing, not just help with his son's healing, but partnership in the daily work of rebuilding their family into something new and sustainable. "I would like that very much," David said. "If you're willing to consider it." Rosa's smile was soft and complex, filled with emotions that David was beginning to recognize as the complicated joy of choosing to love again after loss. "I think I'd like to consider it very much." The afternoon that followed was unlike any David could remember since Elena's death. Instead of retreating to his study to lose himself in work, he found himself drawn into Marcus's world in ways that felt both natural and revolutionary. They worked together to clean up the pancake mess, with Marcus insisting on washing dishes even though he had to stand on a step stool to reach the sink properly. Rosa introduced them to card games that she'd learned as a child in Mexico, simple games that required more laughter than skill. David found himself competitive in ways that had nothing to do with business or achievement and everything to do with the pure joy of play. When Marcus dozed off during an afternoon movie, curled against David's side on the oversized sectional in the media room, David realized that this was the first time in 5 years that his son had fallen asleep in his presence. The trust implicit in that unconscious gesture moved him more deeply than any business success ever had. Rosa sat in the armchair nearby, working on some kind of embroidery that she pulled from a canvas bag that seemed to contain an endless supply of nurturing supplies. The domestic tranquility of the scene should have felt foreign to David, whose life had been structured around meetings and deals and the constant motion of high-stakes business. Instead, it felt like coming home to himself. "Rosa," he said quietly, not wanting to wake Marcus. "Can I ask you about your background? Your training, I mean. You seem to know so much about child psychology, about trauma, about healing." Rosa looked up from her needlework, considering his question. "I have no formal training, Mr. Chen. What I know, I learned from living through my own losses and from helping others navigate theirs." David frowned slightly. "But the techniques you use, the way you understand Marcus's needs, the ritual healing approaches. That can't all be intuitive." "My grandmother was a curandera," Rosa said, returning to her embroidery. "A traditional healer. She taught me that there are many ways to mend what's broken, and most of them don't require degrees or certifications. They just require presence, patience, and the willingness to sit with pain until it transforms itself into something else." David realized that he was learning something fundamental about the difference between fixing and healing. His instinct had always been to identify problems and solve them through the application of resources and expertise. Rosa's approach was more organic, more about creating conditions where natural healing processes could unfold in their own time and their own way. "Is that what you're doing with us?" Sitting with our pain until it transforms? Rosa tied off a thread and looked up at him with eyes that held depths he was only beginning to understand. I'm helping you learn to sit with it yourselves. My job isn't to take away your grief, Mr. Chen. It's to teach you and Marcus that you're strong enough to carry it without being destroyed by it. The wisdom in her words resonated through David's chest like a bell being struck. For 5 years, he'd been trying to manage away the pain of Elena's loss, to create structures and routines that would insulate both him and Marcus from the full impact of their grief. Rosa was showing them that the goal wasn't to avoid the pain, but to develop the capacity to feel it fully without being overwhelmed by it. Marcus stirred in his sleep, making small sounds that might have been the beginning of distress. Without conscious thought, David began stroking his son's hair in the same rhythm that Elena used to use, a gentle repetitive motion that seemed to soothe Marcus back into peaceful rest. Rosa noticed the gesture and smiled. She taught you well. I'd forgotten, David admitted. I'd forgotten so many of the small things she did that made our house feel like home. They're not forgotten, Rosa said gently. They're just buried under the grief. As Marcus heals, you'll find that your own memories become more accessible. Healing isn't just individual. It's collective. Families heal together, or they don't heal at all. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Marcus asked if he could sleep in David's room. Not because he was afraid, he was careful to explain, but because he wanted to be close. David found himself agreeing without the usual concerns about establishing proper boundaries or encouraging dependence. They set up a sleeping bag on the floor beside David's bed, creating a temporary campsite that felt both playful and profoundly meaningful. As Marcus settled into his makeshift bed, he looked up at David with an expression of contentment that had been absent for so long that David had almost forgotten what it looked like. "Daddy," Marcus said sleepily, "do you think today was a good day?" David considered the question seriously. The day had started with destruction and terror, had included exhaustion and emotional intensity, and had required him to step outside every comfort zone he'd constructed over the past 5 years. By any objective measure, it had been chaotic and challenging and far removed from the controlled environment he'd thought Marcus needed. "I think today was a real day," David said finally. "A day where we felt big feelings and did hard things and came through them together. I think those might be the most important kinds of days." Marcus nodded sagely. "Rosa says the best days aren't always the easy days." As David turned off the lights and settled into his own bed, he found himself thinking about Rosa's words about families healing together. For the first time since Elena's death, he was beginning to believe that healing was actually possible, not just for Marcus but for both of them. And more than that, he was beginning to understand that the process of healing together might create something new and beautiful from the wreckage of their loss. The house settled around them with the quiet sounds of a home where people were learning to live again rather than simply exist. And in the darkness, father and son breathed in rhythm, no longer alone in their sorrow, no longer trapped in the silence that had defined their lives for so long. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, carried by a courier in a black sedan that looked more like a government vehicle than a delivery service. David accepted the thick manila envelope with growing unease, recognizing the law firm's letterhead embossed in gold across the top. Whitmore, Hastings and Associates had been Elena's family attorneys for 3 generations, and they never sent casual correspondence. Inside his study, David broke the wax seal and spread the documents across his desk. The cover letter was brief and devastating. Elena's parents, Robert and Catherine Whitmore, were filing for custody of Marcus. They claimed that David's unconventional household arrangements and failure to provide appropriate therapeutic intervention created an unsafe environment for their grandson. The supporting documentation was thorough and calculating. Private investigator photographs showed Marcus playing in flour-covered clothes in the kitchen, his hands dirty and his hair disheveled. Security footage from the mansion's cameras captured the night Marcus had destroyed his bedroom, with timestamps that the Whitmore's legal team had carefully annotated to emphasize the duration and intensity of his breakdown. Most damaging of all was a psychiatric evaluation they'd commissioned from Dr. Harrison Webb, a child psychologist who'd never actually met Marcus but had based his assessment on interviews with their previous housekeeper and observations of Marcus's behavior at family gatherings. Dr. Webb's report painted Rosa as an unqualified caregiver whose folk remedies were delaying Marcus's access to evidence-based treatment. David's hands shook as he read the final paragraph of Dr. Webb's evaluation. The child exhibits signs of severe attachment disorder and developmental regression that could be irreversibly worsened by continued exposure to unprofessional therapeutic interventions. Immediate removal from the current environment and placement in a structured therapeutic setting is strongly recommended. The custody hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. 6 days to prepare a defense against people who had unlimited resources and a legal team that specialized in high-stakes family litigation. 6 days to prove that the healing Marcus had experienced over the past 2 months was real, sustainable, and in his best interests. David found Rosa in the garden behind the house, where she was teaching Marcus to identify different herbs by their scent. His son was laughing as he buried his nose in a sprig of rosemary, his face scrunched up in concentration as he tried to memorize the sharp, clean smell. "We need to talk," David said quietly, trying to keep his voice level so as not to alarm Marcus. Rosa looked up at him and immediately understood that something serious had happened. "Marcus, why don't you pick some mint for our afternoon tea?" she suggested. "The good leaves are by the fountain." As Marcus wandered off with a small basket, Rosa stood and faced David directly. "What's happened?" David handed her the legal documents, watching her face carefully as she read. Rosa's expression remained calm, but he noticed the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she understood the implications immediately. "They want to take him away," David said when she'd finished reading. "They want to take him back," Rosa corrected gently. "Back to the place he was before he started healing. Before he started remembering how to live." David began pacing across the stone pathway, his mind racing through possible strategies and defenses. "We need character witnesses. Documentation of Marcus's progress. Maybe Dr. Peterson would testify about how much improvement he's seen since you arrived." Rosa folded the papers carefully and handed them back to him. "Mr. Chen, are you prepared to fight for what we've built here?" The question stopped David mid-stride. He looked at Rosa, then across the garden to where Marcus was carefully selecting mint leaves, his small face peaceful and focused in ways that would have been impossible just months earlier. "Of course I'm prepared to fight. He's my son." "That's not what I'm asking," Rosa said. "Fighting in court is one thing. But are you prepared to defend the changes we've made in your life? The messiness, the emotional honesty, the way we've learned to let feelings exist without trying to control them?" David realized that Rosa was pointing to something fundamental about the custody challenge. The Whitmores weren't just questioning his parenting or Rosa's qualifications. They were attacking an entirely different philosophy of healing, one that prioritized emotional authenticity over behavioral control. Elena's parents have always believed that money and professional intervention can solve any problem, David said slowly, working through his thoughts out loud. They see Marcus's progress as chaos because it doesn't fit their model of what recovery should look like. Rosa nodded. "And if you fight their case on their terms, using their definitions of success and their standards of care, you'll lose. Because by their measures, what we're doing here does look like chaos." Marcus returned with his basket of mint, his hands soil-stained and his cheeks flushed with outdoor air. "Rosa, look. I found the chocolate mint you told me about. It really does smell different." David watched his son present his discovery with pride and enthusiasm, and felt a fierce protectiveness rise in his chest. The boy who stood before them was engaged with the world in ways that bore no resemblance to the silent, withdrawn child the Whitmores remembered from their formal family dinners. "Marcus," David said, crouching down to his son's eye level, "how would you feel about talking to some people about how things have been going here at home? About Rosa and the things we've been doing together?" Marcus tilted his head thoughtfully. "What kind of people?" David glanced at Rosa, who nodded encouragingly. "Some lawyers, and maybe a judge. They want to make sure you're happy and safe." "Am I not safe?" Marcus asked, a flicker of worry crossing his features. "You're very safe," David assured him quickly. But sometimes adults have different ideas about what's best for children, and they need to talk about it to make sure everyone agrees. Marcus considered this with the seriousness that he brought to most adult conversations these days. Would Rosa have to leave if they don't like our ideas? The directness of the question hit David like a physical blow. Traditional therapeutic approaches had yielded minimal progress. When Mr. Chen hired Ms. Martinez, I was initially skeptical of her methods, but I cannot argue with the results. He described Marcus's transformation in clinical terms that translated Rosa's intuitive healing into language the court could understand. The child is now engaging in age-appropriate social interaction, expressing emotions verbally rather than through behavioral acting out, and demonstrating attachment behaviors that had been completely absent since his mother's death. But it was Rosa's own testimony that proved to be the turning point. She spoke simply and directly about her work with Marcus, explaining her approach in terms that were both accessible and profound. Your Honor, I don't believe that healing trauma requires expensive equipment or clinical settings. It requires presence, patience, and the willingness to meet a child where they are emotionally rather than where we think they should be. Victoria Sterling's cross-examination was aggressive, focusing on Rosa's lack of formal credentials and questioning the sustainability of Marcus's progress. Ms. Martinez, isn't it true that you have no licensed training in child psychology? That's correct, Rosa replied calmly. But I have extensive experience with grief and loss, both personal and professional. I've helped dozens of families work through trauma using traditional healing practices that have been effective for generations. Traditional healing practices, Sterling repeated with barely concealed skepticism. Are you asking this court to entrust the welfare of a vulnerable child to folk remedies? Rosa's response was measured but powerful. I'm asking this court to recognize that healing comes in many forms. Marcus's progress speaks for itself. He's learning to process his grief in healthy ways, to form secure attachments, and to engage with the world around him. These are the goals of any therapeutic intervention. Judge Hernandez asked several pointed questions about Rosa's educational plans and long-term commitment to the family. When Rosa explained her acceptance to the UCLA graduate program, the judge's interest was clearly piqued. So you're seeking formal credentials to complement your experiential knowledge? Yes, Your Honor. I believe that combining traditional healing wisdom with modern psychological training will make me more effective in helping families navigate trauma and loss. The final testimony came from an unexpected source, Marcus himself. Despite their agreement to keep him away from the courthouse, David's legal team had arranged for a private interview with Judge Hernandez in her chambers, away from the formal courtroom setting. David wasn't present for this conversation, but Janet Morrison later told him that Marcus had spoken with remarkable clarity about his life, his feelings about Rosa, and his desire to remain in the home where he'd learned to heal. He's an extraordinary child, Judge Hernandez had apparently told the attorneys afterward. Wise beyond his years, but in ways that suggest healing rather than premature maturation due to trauma. The court recessed for lunch, giving both sides time to prepare closing arguments. David found himself walking the courthouse corridors with Rosa, both of them too nervous to eat but needing to move to manage their anxiety. Whatever happens, David said as they stood by a window overlooking the city, I want you to know that you've given us something irreplaceable. You've taught us how to be a family again. Rosa looked out at the sprawling cityscape, her expression thoughtful. Families aren't made by law, Mr. Chen. They're made by choice, by commitment, by showing up for each other day after day. Whatever this judge decides, that won't change. The afternoon session focused on closing arguments. Victoria Sterling made a compelling case for the stability and resources that the Whitmores could provide, emphasizing their experience raising Elena and their commitment to giving Marcus every advantage. But Janet Morrison's closing argument focused on something more fundamental, the question of what healing actually looked like, and whether the court should prioritize conventional approaches over demonstrated results. Your Honor, we're not here to defend unconventional methods for their own sake. We're here to defend a child's right to heal in the environment where he's found safety, connection, and hope. Marcus Chen is not the same child who entered his father's care 2 months ago. He's not the silent, withdrawn boy his grandparents remember. He's becoming himself again, in all his complexity and potential. Judge Hernandez took the case under advisement, announcing that she would issue her ruling within 48 hours. As the courtroom emptied, David felt simultaneously drained and hyper-alert, as if his entire nervous system was suspended between hope and dread. The drive home was quiet, both David and Rosa lost in their own thoughts about what the next 2 days would bring. When they arrived at the mansion, they found Marcus playing in the garden with the temporary babysitter, his laughter carrying across the grounds like music. "How did it go?" Marcus asked, running to meet them with dirt under his fingernails and joy in his eyes. David knelt down and pulled his son into a fierce hug. "We told our story as clearly as we could. Now we wait to see if the judge understands what we've built together." That night, the three of them had dinner by candlelight in the kitchen, a simple meal that felt like both celebration and farewell. They didn't talk about the court case or the uncertain future. Instead, they focused on the present moment, the taste of Rosa's homemade tortillas, the warmth of the flickering flames, the sound of Marcus's voice as he told them about the butterflies he'd seen in the garden. Wednesday morning arrived with brilliant sunshine, as if the weather was mocking their anxiety. David's phone rang at exactly 10 a.m. Janet Morrison's voice was professional but warm as she delivered the news that would reshape their lives. "David, we won." Judge Hernandez ruled in favor of maintaining the current custody arrangement. She was particularly impressed by Marcus's progress and Rosa's commitment to professional development. David sank into his desk chair, relief flooding through him like a physical force. "What were the specific terms?" "Continued primary custody with you, with regular visitation rights for the Whitmores. Rosa can continue in her role as primary caregiver, with the understanding that she'll be pursuing formal credentials. The court also recommended regular check-ins with Dr. Peterson to monitor Marcus's continued progress." When David shared the news with Rosa and Marcus, their reactions were beautifully different. Marcus whooped with joy and ran around the kitchen island 3 times before launching himself into David's arms. Rosa simply smiled with quiet satisfaction, as if she'd never doubted the outcome. "Does this mean we can keep being a family?" Marcus asked, his arms still wrapped around David's neck. "It means we get to choose what our family looks like," David replied. "And we choose each other." The celebration that followed was both spontaneous and profound. They decided to plant a tree in the garden to mark the day, a Japanese maple that would grow and change along with their family. As they worked together to dig the hole and position the young tree, David realized that this was exactly the kind of moment Elena would have treasured, simple, meaningful, rooted in love and hope for the future. That evening, as they sat on the back patio watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, Marcus asked Rosa about her school plans. "Will you still have time to teach me things when you're learning new things too?" Rosa smiled and ruffled his hair affectionately. "I think we'll be learning together, Mijo. That's how the best families work." David looked at the two people who had become the center of his world and felt a contentment he hadn't experienced since Elena's death. Not the desperate happiness of someone trying to escape grief, but the deeper satisfaction of someone who had learned to carry loss without being crushed by it. The custody battle had forced them to articulate what they'd built together, to defend their unconventional approach to healing, and ultimately to choose each other with full awareness of what that choice meant. They were no longer just 3 people sharing a house while they recovered from trauma. They were a family, deliberately and permanently. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Marcus fell asleep in David's lap while Rosa hummed a lullaby in Spanish. David didn't want to move, didn't want to break the spell of perfect peace that had settled over them. In the distance, the lights of Beverly Hills twinkled like earthbound stars, a reminder of the world beyond their garden walls. But for the first time in years, that world felt manageable, approachable, full of possibility rather than threat. They had fought for their right to heal in their own way, in their own time, guided by love rather than protocol. And they had won not just a legal victory, but something far more precious, the knowledge that they were strong enough to face whatever challenges lay ahead, as long as they faced them together. The house that had once echoed with silence now hummed with the quiet contentment of people who had learned to transform grief into gratitude, loss into love, and trauma into the kind of wisdom that could only be earned through surviving together. In the end, that transformation was the most powerful testimony of all. 3 years later, the kitchen that had once been a sterile showcase of wealth now bore the beautiful scars of a family truly living within its walls. Flower fingerprints decorated the lower cabinets at Marcus's height, and the marble island showed the gentle stains of countless cooking adventures that no amount of professional cleaning could completely erase. The morning light streaming through the windows illuminated a scene that would have horrified the old David Chin, but filled the current version with deep satisfaction. Marcus, now 10 years old and tall for his age, stood on a sturdy wooden stool beside Rosa, carefully measuring ingredients for what had become their Saturday tradition, Elena's sugar cookies with colored frosting. His movements were confident and precise, the result of years spent learning that mistakes in the kitchen were opportunities rather than disasters. "Rosa, the purple frosting needs more food coloring," Marcus announced, holding up a spoon with what looked distinctly like lavender icing. "Mama always said purple should be brave, not scared." Rosa laughed, the sound rich and warm in the morning air. Her hair now showed more silver than black, and her face carried the kind of lines that came from years of genuine smiles. The master's degree in counseling psychology hanging in her small office upstairs had been earned through night classes and weekend study sessions, never once interrupting her primary role as the heart of their household. "Your mama was very wise about colors," Rosa agreed, adding another drop of purple dye to the bowl. "What other wisdom did she share with you about baking?" Marcus's face took on the thoughtful expression that he wore when accessing memories that felt both distant and immediate. "She said that the best cookies were made with happy hands and grateful hearts. And that if you taste the batter too many times, you'll spoil your appetite for the finished cookies." David entered the kitchen carrying his laptop and coffee mug, dressed in jeans and a UCLA sweatshirt that Rosa had bought him as a joke but which had become his favorite weekend uniform. The transformation from sharp business suits to comfortable casual wear reflected a deeper change in how he approached life itself. "Good morning, my master bakers," David said, kissing the top of Marcus's head and squeezing Rosa's shoulder in the easy affection that had become natural between them. "How's the cookie production line looking today?" "We're making extras for the school fundraiser," Marcus explained, carefully piping yellow frosting onto a star-shaped cookie. "Mrs. Patterson says our cookies are the most popular item at every event." David felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with business achievements or financial success. His son had become known at school not just for his academic performance or his family's wealth, but for the joy he brought to community events through simple acts of sharing and kindness. The transformation in Marcus over the past 3 years had been remarkable to witness. The shy, withdrawn boy who had once communicated primarily through silence had evolved into someone who spoke with confidence, laughed easily, and approached new experiences with curiosity rather than fear. He still carried the sensitivity that had always been part of his nature, but now it manifested as empathy and emotional intelligence rather than overwhelming vulnerability. "Dad, can we invite the Whitmores to the school spring festival next week?" Marcus asked, not looking up from his decorating. "Grandpa Robert said he'd never been to a real elementary school carnival, and I think he might actually enjoy the ring toss." David and Rosa exchanged a glance that conveyed volumes about how far their family had come. The relationship with Elena's parents had undergone its own healing process over the past 3 years, evolving from bitter legal adversaries to cautious allies in Marcus's well-being. The weekly Sunday dinners at the Whitmore mansion had become opportunities for Marcus to maintain connection with his maternal heritage while also sharing stories about his daily life with David and Rosa. "I think that's a wonderful idea," David replied. "Your grandparents have been asking when they could see more of your school world." The integration of the Whitmores into their unconventional family structure had required patience and compromise from all parties involved. Robert and Catherine had initially struggled to understand Rosa's role, seeing her as either hired help or an interloper rather than recognizing her as a true family member. But Marcus's obvious happiness and continued emotional growth had gradually won them over, and they'd eventually come to view Rosa with the respect due to someone who had given their grandson something they couldn't provide themselves: the ability to process grief without being consumed by it. Rosa had handled their initial skepticism with the same graceful patience she brought to all challenging situations. She never demanded recognition or defended her methods, simply continued to show up consistently in Marcus's life while the results spoke for themselves. When Catherine Whitmore finally asked Rosa for advice about managing her own lingering grief over Elena's death, everyone understood that a fundamental shift had occurred in the family dynamics. "Rosa, I need to tell you something," Marcus said, setting down his frosting bag and turning to face her with an expression of unusual seriousness. "Ms. Anderson wants to meet with you next week." Rosa raised her eyebrows questioningly. Ms. Anderson was the school counselor who had worked with Marcus during his first difficult months of readjustment to academic life. "Is everything okay, Mijo?" Marcus grinned, his serious expression dissolving into mischief. "She wants to ask if you'd be willing to volunteer with some of the other kids who are having tough times. She says I told her about how you helped me learn to be sad without being scared, and she thinks other kids might need to learn that too." David felt his chest tighten with emotion as he watched Rosa process this request. Over the years, she'd occasionally mentioned her dream of expanding her healing work beyond their family, but she'd always prioritized Marcus's needs above her own professional ambitions. "What do you think about that?" Rosa asked Marcus carefully. "Would you be comfortable with me spending some time helping other children?" Marcus considered the question with the gravity he brought to all important decisions. "I think Mama would want you to help other kids who are sad like I was. And I'm not scared anymore about you leaving, because I know our family is strong enough now." The wisdom in those words hit David like a revelation. His son had reached a level of emotional security that allowed him to share Rosa's gifts with others, understanding that love multiplied rather than diminished when it was offered more broadly. "I think," David said quietly, "that sounds like exactly the kind of work you were meant to do." The morning continued with the comfortable rhythm that had become their weekend routine. Marcus finished decorating his cookies while David helped Rosa package the extras for school. They moved around each other in the kitchen with the unconscious choreography of people who had learned to share space harmoniously, each anticipating the other's needs and movements. At noon, they loaded the cookies into the car and drove to Marcus's school for the weekend volunteer appreciation event. David parked between a modest Honda Civic and a luxury SUV, their own vehicle falling somewhere in the middle of the economic spectrum represented in the school parking lot. Marcus had specifically requested to attend the local public school rather than the exclusive private academies that David could easily afford, wanting to be part of a more diverse community where his family's wealth didn't set him apart from his classmates. The school gymnasium had been decorated with colorful streamers and balloons, and the air buzzed with the energy of families coming together for a common purpose. Marcus immediately ran off to find his friends, his confidence in social situations a stark contrast to the isolation that had once defined his interactions with peers. David and Rosa set up their cookie table alongside other volunteer families, and David found himself in conversations with parents he'd never expected to connect with, a single mother who worked 2 jobs to support her children, a retired teacher who volunteered in the library, a young father who coached Little League on weekends. These relationships had enriched David's understanding of community in ways that his previous social circle of wealthy executives never could have. "Mr. Chen?" A small voice caught his attention, and David turned to see a girl who looked about Marcus's age standing beside their table with obvious nervousness. "Hi there," David said gently, crouching down to her eye level in the way Rosa had taught him years ago. "I'm Marcus's dad. What's your name?" "I'm Sophie," she replied quietly. "Marcus said you and Miss Rosa make the best cookies in the world, and that Miss Rosa knows how to help kids who feel too much sadness." David's heart clenched at the careful way Sophie phrased her need. He looked across the gymnasium and spotted Rosa deep in conversation with a woman who had the exhausted look of a parent dealing with more than she could handle alone. "Would you like to meet Rosa?" David asked Sophie gently. Sophie nodded eagerly, and David led her across the room to where Rosa was listening to the other parent with her characteristic attention and compassion. "Rosa," David said quietly, "I'd like you to meet Sophie. She's heard that you're someone who understands about big feelings." Rosa's face softened as she knelt down to Sophie's level. "Hello, sweetheart. Marcus has told me about you. He says you're the best artist in your class." Sophie's face lit up at being remembered and recognized for her talents rather than her struggles. "I draw pictures when I feel too much inside," she explained to Rosa. "But sometimes the feelings are bigger than the paper." "I understand," Rosa replied with complete sincerity. "Would you like to know a secret about feelings that are bigger than paper?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "They're not meant to stay on paper," Rosa said gently. "They're meant to move through you like weather through the sky. Sometimes stormy, sometimes sunny, but always changing, always moving, never stuck in one place forever." David watched this interaction with the same awe he'd felt 3 years ago when Rosa first reached through Marcus's silence. Her gift wasn't just technique or training, though those had certainly enhanced her abilities. Her gift was the rare combination of wisdom and compassion that allowed her to see past a child's surface behavior to the deeper needs underneath. As the afternoon progressed, David observed Rosa naturally attracting other parents and children who sensed her unusual capacity for understanding and healing. She didn't advertise her skills or seek out these connections, but they found her with the inevitability of water flowing toward the sea. Marcus appeared at David's side as they were packing up their empty cookie containers, his face flushed with happiness from an afternoon spent playing with friends and helping younger children navigate the various game booths. "Dad, did you see Rosa talking to all those families?" Marcus asked. "I think she's going to help a lot of kids learn what I learned." David ruffled his son's hair affectionately. "How does that make you feel?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "Proud," he said finally. "And grateful that we got to learn it first, so we could be strong enough to share her with other people who need her." On the drive home, Rosa was unusually quiet, staring out the window at the familiar streets of their neighborhood. David could sense her processing the connections she'd made that afternoon, the requests for help, the opportunities to expand her healing work beyond their family unit. "Rosa," David said as they pulled into their driveway, "I want you to know that whatever direction you choose to take your work, we'll support it completely. You've given us the foundation we need to thrive, and now it's time for you to build the career you've always dreamed of." Rosa turned to look at him with tears in her eyes. "Are you sure? I don't want to take anything away from our family time." Marcus leaned forward from the back seat, inserting himself into the conversation with characteristic directness. "Rosa, remember what you taught me about love? That it gets bigger when you share it, not smaller." Rosa laughed through her tears, reaching back to squeeze Marcus's hand. "When did you get so wise, Mijo?" "I had good teachers," Marcus replied with a grin. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table sharing takeout Chinese food and planning the upcoming week, David realized that their family had achieved something remarkable. They had healed not just from Elena's death, but into a new configuration that honored her memory while creating space for growth and service to others. Rosa's acceptance of the volunteer counseling position at Marcus's school would be the first step in what David suspected would become a significant expansion of her healing work. Marcus's emotional resilience and social confidence would allow him to navigate increasingly complex social situations while maintaining the sensitivity that made him such a compassionate friend to struggling peers. And David himself had discovered that success measured in terms of family well-being and community contribution felt infinitely more meaningful than any business achievement. As they cleared the dinner dishes together, Marcus asked the question that had become their evening ritual: "What was the best part of your day?" Rosa spoke first. "Meeting Sophie and her mother, and realizing that our family's healing journey was preparing me to help other families find their own paths forward." David considered his answer carefully. "Watching you connect with those families today, and seeing how Marcus has grown into someone who can share your gifts with pride rather than jealousy." Marcus saved his answer for last, as he always did. "The best part was realizing that even though we'll always miss Mama, we've built something beautiful that she would be proud of. And that we're strong enough now to help other people build beautiful things too." Later that night, after Marcus had gone to bed and Rosa had retired to her room to work on graduate school assignments, David found himself standing in the garden where they'd planted the Japanese maple tree 3 years earlier. The tree had grown significantly, its branches now providing genuine shade and its seasonal changes marking the passage of time in their healing journey. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photos he'd accumulated over the years, Marcus laughing while covered in cookie dough, Rosa teaching a group of neighborhood children to identify plants by smell, family dinners that included the Whitmores and various friends they'd collected along the way. Each image told part of the story of their transformation from a household defined by grief to a family characterized by growth, service, and joy. A text message from his business partner reminded him that he had early meetings scheduled for Monday, returning him to the world of mergers and acquisitions that still paid for their comfortable lifestyle. But that world no longer defined him the way it once had. He'd learned to be successful in business while keeping his priorities firmly anchored in the relationships and values that Rosa and Marcus had helped him rediscover. As David headed inside, he paused at Marcus's bedroom door to check on his sleeping son. In the moonlight streaming through the windows, he could see the memory altar they'd built together years earlier, now expanded to include photos from school events, artwork Marcus had created, and small treasures that marked significant moments in their family's ongoing story. The boy who had once been trapped in silence now slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that he was loved, valued, and supported in becoming whoever he was meant to be. The transformation from traumatized child to confident, compassionate young person represented not just individual healing, but the kind of generational change that would ripple forward into all of Marcus's future relationships and endeavors. In her own room down the hall, Rosa was probably reading research articles for her thesis on family systems therapy, combining her intuitive wisdom with academic frameworks in ways that would enhance her ability to help other families navigate trauma and loss. Her journey from housekeeper to graduate student to community healer represented the kind of personal growth that became possible when people were given space and support to become their fullest selves. David settled into bed with a contentment that had nothing to do with external achievements and everything to do with the daily miracle of choosing love over fear, growth over stagnation, service over self-protection. Their family had been forged in grief but had evolved into something that created joy not just for themselves, but for everyone whose lives they touched. In the quiet of the sleeping house, David could almost sense Elena's presence, not as an absence to be mourned, but as a continuing influence that had shaped their capacity for love, resilience, and generosity. She would be proud, he knew, not just of Marcus's remarkable recovery, but of the family they'd all built together in the aftermath of loss. The story that had begun with a billionaire's mute son and a wise housekeeper had evolved into something much larger, a testament to the healing power of unconditional love, the importance of meeting people where they are rather than where we think they should be, and the miraculous capacity of human beings to transform trauma into wisdom, grief into gratitude, and loss into a deeper appreciation for the preciousness of connection. As sleep finally overtook him, David's last conscious thought was a prayer of gratitude for the family they'd become and the community they'd learned to serve. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but they would face them together, with the confidence that comes from having learned to love well in the midst of life's inevitable sorrows and joys. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.